Welcome to Engaging Ideas, where we bring information and ideas from the academy to the community to help think about real-world questions. Our topic today is the business of cannabis, or marijuana. Public and government support for cannabis legislation is increasing nationally and globally. But many questions remain over the societal impacts of legalization and specific issues, including medical research, impaired driving, consumption of marijuana in public, and more. Colorado was the first U.S. state to legalize cannabis for both medical and recreational use, and it is home of the world's most sophisticated and regulated cannabis market. An increasing number of states and other nations are also legalizing marijuana. This is giving rise to a nascent but potentially huge industry. Joining me today to look at the evolution of legalized marijuana and the emergence of the cannabis industry is Paul Seaborn, Assistant Professor of Management at the University of Denver's Daniels College of Business. His research and teaching interests lie in the area of business strategy and government policy, with a particular focus on regulated industries, including marijuana and cannabis as an industry. In 2014, he published one of the first teaching cases on the marijuana industry, and in 2017 taught the first ever Business of Marijuana course at an accredited business school. In just the past few years, Paul has organized or participated in over 10 conference presentations and symposia related to the marijuana industry. His analysis of the industry, including his Colorado Marijuana Market Report, has been featured in over 20 different media outlets. Professor Seaborn has published articles in scholarly journals and has been the recipient of multiple teaching awards, including recognition as one of the Poets and Quant's top 40 undergraduate business professors in 2017. Paul Seaborn, welcome to Engaging Ideas.
Thank you for having me.
Paul, let's begin by talking about the history a little bit of legalized marijuana. In general, what has happened in recent years in the U.S. and other countries in terms of the legalization of marijuana?
Well, it's certainly been a flurry of activity in the last 10 to 20 years after really many decades of really no movement. So if you look all the way back to 1917, Colorado at that time prohibited marijuana, and they were one of the first states to do so, right around the same time as Prohibition. And then the rest of the U.S. federally followed in 1937. And from then until really the 80s and 90s, not too much happened. There's some small efforts around decriminalizing possession for individuals, but that was it. And then really in the 90s leading into the 2000s, a couple of leading states, California was one and Colorado was another, started to see some support for legalization of the medical access to the product. And so the Colorado timing was in the year 2000. We had a ballot initiative called Amendment 20, and a majority of Coloradans supported providing medical access for consumption and also personal cultivation of the plant. And that, even at that point, wasn't an industry, it was more of a personal right. It took some legal challenges, advocating for patients to have other sources of that product around the mid-2000s. It was really 2008 or 2009 before we saw an actual medical industry arise.
Well, let's look a little more closely at that in this respect. So Colorado was the first state to adopt both medical and, as you said, recreational use. So what's happened then here in Colorado? How has Colorado regulated the marijuana industry?
Yeah, as you mentioned in the intro, I think most would point to Colorado as one of the more sophisticated and highly regulated industries. And our approach in Colorado has been to have two parallel regulatory systems, one for medical access, one for recreational or adult use access. And so there's some similarities between the two, but also quite a few differences in terms of even the age, so 18 and above for medical, 21 and above for recreational. Taxation is a little bit different, being lower on the medical side. The product characteristics, potencies can differ depending on the two sides. And the points of access where these products are manufactured, cultivated, sold also may differ depending on what different businesses have chosen to do. So we've got these two systems operating side by side.
So you mentioned a number of other states are legalizing marijuana or for medical or recreational or both. How are they coming at this? Are they taking Colorado's approach or doing something different?
Well, I think there's been lots of lessons learned from Colorado, which has been, I guess, one of our gifts to the rest of the country is that we were the early adopters and really had to struggle with a lot of the aspects that no one had ever really considered. But at the same time, it's actually been a bit surprising how different many of these other jurisdictions have gone with their approach. So at current time in August 2018, we've got 9 states plus the District of Columbia that have moved to legalize recreational adult use, and we're up to, I think, around 31 states at this point that have some form of a medical legalization process. But I would say there's really none that has taken as much of a free market approach as Colorado, in which Colorado really set high standards for getting a license in this industry, background checks, sufficient capital, approval from the local authorities and kind of a suitable location, a variety of really difficult and important qualifications. But assuming that an applicant met those, they could get a license. There was no set quota or kind of predefined number. And what we're seeing in a lot of the other states, particularly on the eastern side of the U.S., is starting from day one with a pre-decided quota, maybe 24 total licenses or 12 large and 12 small, something like that. And then the government has much more influence in picking who those particular successful applicants are.
Paul, you brought a graphic which I think addresses this. Very interesting. Could you sort of explain that?
Yeah, so I think what sometimes gets lost in the discussion of the various states is it's not just about who was first. So obviously Colorado was first to really allow for both medical and recreational. Washington was shortly behind us, having voted at the same time. Oregon, Nevada since then. But there's really, I think, more to it. And so one of the many DU and Daniels alumni in the industry, Ryan Smith, brought this graphic to my class, and we worked on this with the students. And I think it really does a nice job of just showing some other factors. One being, if you look at the size of these circles, kind of a rough estimate of the market size. So Colorado, yes, we were first, but we're a relatively small state, 5 million residents. You know, we get some tourists. That kind of is dwarfed by California, which just has such a huge population right there. And then secondly, if you look across the left to right dimension, the states that were early on, the Washingtons, the Colorados, California, today they just have a much more mature market, meaning there's more access, maybe more variety of products. The companies and the individual involved have learned a lot about this industry. If you go to the far left, you've got some really big influential states that are really early on in terms of figuring some of that out. And then top to bottom, there's different approaches in terms of how regulated some of these states have been. So again, Ryan and I kind of agree that Colorado, Washington, Oregon are really at the high point in terms of pretty sophisticated, established regulatory processes. California, though, you see we have it shown a bit lower down because they really had a kind of a gray market, unregulated medical system for a long time, really about 20 years. And only now are they trying to move upwards in terms of more formally regulating both the medical and rec.
And you were saying earlier that states like Colorado allow more entrepreneurial activity in terms, while it's regulated, it isn't as restricted. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, I think there's a real balancing act for governments. If they set up a set of requirements and allow all applicants to meet those requirements, it just creates a larger, more robust system, but also there's more actors to monitor and vet and continue to follow. So some states have taken, I guess, a more cautious approach of limiting how many participants are in the industry to start with. I think that gives them a sense that they can really focus in on each of those. But at the same time, it kind of takes away from letting the market and those participants figure out who has the right approach, who's meeting the needs of the market. It's kind of a little bit more of a heavy hand in terms of what goes on.
So we've talked about Colorado and the U.S. market, but as you mentioned earlier, the legalization of marijuana is happening on a global basis. What is happening worldwide with this issue?
Yeah, I think that's been a very interesting thing to follow. First of all, most countries seem to do this at the country level, not at the state level as the U.S. has done. On the medical side, we're up to 9 or 10 countries that have a full legal medical system, and those are countries, listeners would be familiar with, Germany, Italy, Canada, Australia, those types of places. Very, very little movement to have full medical and recreational. So there's been one country for the last few years that's been the first, and that's Uruguay of all places. But now this October 17th, Canada, which is actually my home country, they'll be the second to have a full national recreational system. And I think that's of great interest to people around the world because it's a larger country than Uruguay, and it probably will really be a much more full test of this change that the U.S. has not really come to yet, having really done things on a state-by-state basis.
Right. So one of the topics here in Colorado, and I'm sure elsewhere, about legalized marijuana, there's a lot of discussion about tax revenues. And produced by the industry. Can you discuss that a bit? Are the tax revenues significant?
I think that's a great question. So if you looked at 2017 at the state level, we brought in around $247 million of tax revenue through this industry. And that would include both medical and recreational, and really three primary taxes, about a 3% tax on medical sales, in addition to your customary sales taxes. There's a 15% excise tax on recreational sales, so that happens behind the scenes before it gets to the end purchaser. And then we have a 15% tax, used to be 10, at that last phase of purchase for recreational. So those three streams were bringing in about $247 million last year in a very complicated system of where it's allocated. It's been spelled out around educational priorities, substance abuse, et cetera. So on the one hand, I think people would agree that's a lot of money, $247 million. On the other hand, when you look at our state budget, it's really less than 1% of our total revenue as a state. So at the same time that we can be, I think, optimistic about that money helping important priorities, it's not something that will change the state's overall budget or economy or allow us to do wild things that no other state has anticipated.
Well, Paul, I want to talk as we continue in part 2 about the business dimensions of the cannabis industry. But thank you for addressing this part. And as we continue on, we'll focus on the business.
Great. Thank you.